Okay. Starting right on time. Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. It's early. Not really. It's a little early. 11:30. Thank you all for coming to the final lecture in the lecture portion of the conference. We'll thank Roger and Julie and everybody who's participated in the event again. Thank you to the students for doing a lot of the back-end work and making it happen. Thank you to all the participants who have participated. Last night we had a lot of autonomy. Today we're going to have whatever the opposite of autonomy is, I think. But that's not how it'll end, I suspect. In any case, very, very happy to have Amale Andraos here to lecture for us today. She is, as you know, the new dean of Columbia GSAAP or APP. I can't remember. There's either two A's or two P's. It's Columbia University, as you know, a Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. If I just said it, I would know it. Recently, she's been dean, I guess, 1 year and a couple of months. You will know that she has taught at all of the right places at all the right times. She was a graduate of McGill University. Her undergraduate professional degree is from McGill. She did a degree at the GSD. Worked in a number of offices, most notably at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture. Has had a remarkable practice since 2006 called Work AC, and you will know that the office is a winner of is a PS1 competition winner, among other things. I am very happy to say, and I'm almost gloating about this, I have a copy of their book, 49 Cities. Not many people do. Amale might want my copy back. I know it's very hard to get. It's an absolutely incredible book. What more can I say? Work AC has about 35 to 40 people in the office. They do a variety of projects. You will know many of them, and she is going to show a number of them this morning. After Amale's lecture, we will do a short lunch break, and then we'll have a concluding discussion with Amale and Hernan. And Brett Steele, if he has returned from fly fishing. It's hard to know. So if he's back, we'll include Brett. Anyway, I'm very, very, very happy. Well, let me just say, Hernan is a very good friend of mine, and I said he's a very talented designer. I disagree with almost everything he says and does. He's a very good friend. He came to my wedding. He's the only person that came to my wedding, but he was not invited. He crashed my wedding. We tried to have a private ceremony, and Hernan crashed my wedding. But I disagree with almost everything he does, but I love him. I also, I can say the opposite about Amale and Work AC. I love everything they do. I can't say that she did not crash my wedding. I guess she did not crash my wedding. I'm just thinking of opposites here. They are not opposite, but I think one of the reasons that Roger, Julie, and I, when we first started to talk about putting people together for major speakers in the series, is to think about new voices leading schools. This is the ACSA conference. We have two brand new deans, one on each coast, one who worked for Rem Koolhaas, one who worked for Peter Eisenman. These are two very different lineages, and in fact, Brett Steele made an argument earlier in his lecture that these were two lineages that we should pay attention to and follow in terms of disciples, not disciplinary practices necessarily. There's some truth to that, but I think it's probably fair to say that that we're in a sense past those kinds of, or we hope we're past those kinds of divisions, though some of those have been played out probably in the panel discussions a little bit here today. But we'll explore that later on. For now, I just want to say I'm very grateful to have Amale here, and I want you to join me in welcoming Amale Andraos. you have a clicker?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Michael. I'm very sorry I didn't crash your wedding. So I'm not against oppositions. I just think that right now there is maybe more interesting things happening at intersections, and I think we should just change what the oppositions are, or make them more fluid. There's just too much hybridizing, too many new conversations, I think, to believe that the kind of pure genealogies can be maintained. There's no possibility of purity. And so the title of the conference is Convergence. It could have been speculation, but convergence in the sense of both seeing things converge, whether at a very large kind of scale of thinking. We've been caught in this sort of, the narrative of global urbanization and a kind of postmodern eternal present. But I think that the notion of climate change, not so much as a reality, of course, as a reality, but also as discourse, is converging many things, is making the notion of change and the future possible, even if it's not necessarily a very pleasant future. But the idea that the future is not the same as the past or the present is very important for architects to be able to think about the possibility of the future. And be engaged in shaping that possibility. And so convergence of conversations, of interests, of things coming together in a new form and new ways to create new grounds after this kind of explosion of multiplicities. And I think convergence is maybe a moment in our own practice, Work AC, where sort of the practice is really a practice in the sense of figuring out things through doing and through making, and now we're starting to kind of refocus things. So, and so it's maybe also more a desire to converge rather than to continue the tracks of oppositions, which Michael has been speaking about, and I think which the 2 days were kind of staged to explore and maybe counteract. And so just to make clear, as Hernan, I heard, did yesterday, this is really about Work AC, my practice with my partner Dan Wood, and isn't a reflection on Columbia, even though, of course, as all of you who practice and teach know, there's a kind of strange feedback loop in terms of interests. But so Work AC, just kind of setting the stage. And when we first started very early on, this is how the architect feels like still today. This is a photograph that Dan took in Ordos in Inner Mongolia, where 100 of us were invited in 2008 to design a villa. And this is a desert, and we're all in black. Lost, deterritorialized, kind of suspended, trying to find a new ground to act, and finding our little, trying to look for our little site. And I do think that this kind of deterritorialized, groundless kind of context has been very important generationally in terms of articulating positions and practices. And I think it's this deterritorialization that precisely undermines the kind of comfort of oppositions such as autonomy versus contingency. This deterritorialization, of course, in the face of wild, high-speed urbanism, in the face of questions of density, environmental concerns, scale. Scale is very much a disciplinary problem that can exist at the intersection of the discipline and the world. Obviously, SML-Excel made that case, but I think there's still a kind of counter case to be made for or against scale. The question of representation and communication and the kind of the return of meaning. If you think that in China architecture is speech, what are we doing with that speech is really a kind of a problem that I think we need to bring back, and some of the, I think, return of a sort of postmodern sensibility does have something to do with this kind of return of meaning that is coming from practice, actually from global practice, and I think it's being underexplored and sort of probed, in fact. And so our answer to that kind of deterritorialized and very sort of changing context has been a lot of speculation and kind of speculative projects, kind of projections through drawing and through kind of rethinking, let's say, elements of architecture, such as the core, systems, etc., to try to insert new possibilities for public engagement experiences and a kind of new relationship between the urban and the environmental in particular. At all scales, or looking at kind of the smaller scale of intervention that can have very high impact, and appropriating systems to make them architecture. This is a fish farm, a sculpture proposition for Shenzhen. These speculative projects really led to Public Farm 1, as Michael mentioned, which was our competition entry for PS1 MoMA, a quarter-acre cardboard farm tube that went from 3 foot to 30 feet, the largest paper structure ever built. The sense of strategy in design, strategic interventions, and a real interest in preservation and a kind of desire to minimize sometimes the architectural intervention or statement. And to the extent that sometimes the architecture disappears, or we want to erase it, make it a void to allow for the stuff around or within it to be much more visible and kind of differentiated. So it's a different kind of white, in fact, or absence. Some level of commentary and playfulness with this idea that our architecture is communication as well, and we can use that as a kind of form of engagement, and a kind of refocus on, a focus on, again, if architecture becomes absent, what becomes present, and certainly sort of hybridizing between architecture and landscape or nature or green as a material has been quite important for our practice, and this was really the sort of importance of 49 cities, of kind of rereading 49 visionary cities from a kind of ecological lens, looking at the relationship between the white, the built, and the green, the unbuilt, but rendering the green highly differentiated between the rural, the urban in terms of park and gardens, and then the natural and quote-unquote wilder. We like to design for sometimes we really feel like we don't like to design for humans, so we have designed for dogs and animals. This was our first project. It was a dog house after we left OMA, so it set the tone for the practice. And love to design for kids, this kind of sense of play, a sense of pop in terms of the sensibility, and a sense of really excess somehow. which is kind of just a different, an access through materials rather than through form, and a kind of irreverence at times, which I'm not funny at all, but my partner is, and so he likes to rap. So if you haven't seen his rap for the 3rd edition of 49 Cities, it's good. And so he plays with words, and so we take this idea of architecture as language very literally, and sometimes it generates projects. This was a proposition for the Guggenheim, which became the Flow Show, and using the ramp as a great swimming pool. So there's a lot of fun in the office, which often becomes, as I mentioned, literal, and we try to find the silver lining in the day-to-day grinding of the practice. And so in this spirit, I'll show a number of projects to kind of extract a number of interests and sort of questions, I hope, for where we think architecture can exist or should go. Going back to this famous moment, this Orders, I wanted to pull back an old project which I haven't shown in a long time, but where I think that some of the recent investigations kind of resonate with this old project. Was this villa we were asked to design, a typical scenario for development. Thankfully it never happened, but for a development, and the client was a known, context was pretty shady, etc., etc. And so in this kind of suspended context, we kind of designed a very a sort of introverted house where the kind of thickening of context and experience happened really from the walls outside moving towards the inside, and a kind of layering where even environmental transformations happened within that almost walled house. And so the house really kind of opens up very carefully from the outside in a series of layers that organize a kind of water and landscape at the outer ring, and then moving in has a kind of circulation thickness, which really allows us to liberate a kind of very large central multiple space in the middle. And so you see the kind of thickness of circulation and program at the perimeter, and the kind of void at the middle, which contrasts with density of activity at the upper level of the house, a kind of, but again, kind of working within very strict grid. And so we work a lot in models, and so all these things kind of came together. The outside is really on the inside, and there's a kind of gradient from outside in with a thickening of the perimeter, and a sort of perforation of the facade, and a kind of perforation of the architecture with these kinds of voids that always kind of carved the kind of volume to bring the outside in and create complexity even within a very small envelope. So this kind of perforating of architecture is a theme that kind of carries through many projects, along with the kind of thickening of the outer layer. In Nature City, a project that that was also speculative, we were invited by MoMA and the Buell Center to rethink, in light of the foreclosure crisis, we were invited to rethink the American suburb to rethink it. For us, it was an opportunity to take this question of the American dream, this kind of utopian moment, and see what had become of it, but take very seriously the notion that the desire for both the built and the unbuilt, for a house and a lawn, for that kind of integration, which is something we're interested in, this desire was quite important, and we should not just kind of negate it. And so we often work with precedents or with this sense of an archive, and this is where I think the archive undermines the notion of an archive that is accessible by a new generation of architects now undermines these kind of very pure genealogies, because you can pull anything almost from anywhere. But for us, working with 49 cities, we wanted to re-examine Ebenezer Howard's town country, precisely this kind of moment of origin, somewhat, or one of the origins of the American suburb, where he really said, how do we create the best of both worlds? Of course, we can learn from that today and understand that, the best didn't quite happen, or if it might have happened at certain moments, but not in the way that it's being deployed today. But nevertheless, kind of learning from and saying this was a kind of interesting kind of intention to hybridize. How would we kind of infuse some of the more contemporary or our current sort of concerns. And so the question became from the town country to nature city, where we could provide that integration, but with 5 times kind of typical suburban density combined with 3 times the typical open green space. So more density and more green space. And so the kind of diagram for this sort of new sort of model became these kind of series of piers. The minimal urbanity you could have is 2 streets with blocks in the middle, and if you spread them just enough to have real wildlife exist, working with the ecologist Eric Sanderson, we kind of 70 feet seemed like a good measure. And so really this kind of alternation of high dense urbanity and high density in terms of much more natural environments for wildlife, and then kind of negating the grid in the north-south direction, where using the section of the kind of pier grids, we could kind of move above and below to allow for a north-south circulation of animals and other species, waters, etc. So that's the kind of section where the built allows for the kind of unbuilt to exist under and above. And looking at the suburb, one of the questions, the current suburbs, one of the issue is the undifferentiated green. It's all lawn or kind of singular trees. And so for us, instead, was this kind of multiplying of typologies of green, of landscapes, of gardens that kind of get integrated within the architectural blocks of the housing. So this is the final model where we kind of built one of these piers, and the kind of multiplicity of typologies for the landscape also went hand in hand with the kind of multiplication of typologies for housing. If you look at the typologies you get right now or types really in the kind of current suburban context, I think you have like 19 models of homes, and so to kind of multiply possibilities was very important for us, and to really take seriously this notion of housing as infrastructure and take it kind of quite literally. And so each housing block is not only a kind of different type, but it also performs a kind of ecological, is part of the kind of ecological infrastructure of the site to allow us to, in fact, exist in this environment. And so each housing block performs in terms of energy or water recycling or food composting and or food growing, etc. And all of these are connected as part of the infrastructure of the city. So this is our kind of flower housing where the water is collected, and so now you can have not only a lawn but also a kind of view on the pond, and maybe this is where Brett is, fly fishing, or and an idea of kind of multiplying the perimeter to create new kinds of integration between outside and inside. This was one of two towers where taking the kind of early the exploration of core one step further, the core is seen here as a void that can allow water pressure to be created through kind of the height and becomes a kind of interior celebration of systems and a kind of play with the kind of stacking of this kind of house unit in a new way. Our compost mound, where all of the organic material, food, etc., comes in to create heat that heats up pools that can be used by the public. And here, kind of, this is the mound housing where the kind of two loops allow for very public and very private promenades to kind of bypass one another as you move to the to the top. The courtyard housing, where the kind of wildlife can cross from underneath. And finally, the kind of frame for all of these housing blocks, where just by kind of collapsing the distance between two houses, you can create incredible density and allow still for the individual lawn to exist, but this time at the roof. So kind of very strategic, simple move. So that was kind of our kind of proposal for trying to do more and more together to kind of reinvent the suburb. This second project is a competition we won in St. Petersburg in Russia for New Holland Island. Bringing together kind of strategic interventions, preservation, and this idea of kind of hybridizing architecture and landscape. The New Holland Island is this kind of very interesting triangle in the middle of St. Petersburg, which was sort of carved by Peter the Great. He was obsessed with Venice, and so very artificial ground for the island. With a series of warehouses at the perimeter and kind of very interesting warehouses. I don't know if you can see, but incredibly dense interiors of kind of mitoyen walls. So very, very high density, very tall, monumental exterior. It kind of was always a city within a city, sort of very walled, and no public access from the beginning of its creation to recently after we completed the master plan. Harsh winters and as I mentioned, this kind of density on the interior where these incredible walls were built to allow for wood to be stored vertically to dry, because the entire island allowed for the kind of Russian Navy to expand, and this is where they would build the kind of boats, etc. And so the whole island was meant to kind of sort of as a sort of military industrial complex. And so now turning it into a cultural center, how do you insert new kinds of programs within these very tight bays without sort of introducing a whole new sort of monumental structure in the middle of the island? How do you bring the public not only into the island but into the building? This was a kind of public-private proposition, so the pressures of development on the interior were quite high. And so our kind of competition entry really revolved around the notion of subtraction. We wanted to kind of create architecture by removing architecture rather than by sort of adding. Or when we did add architecture, it would be intimately connected with infrastructure, so the kind of minimum infrastructure required would be the place for architecture. And so this translated into a kind of a big park for the island that we could bring into the buildings to create a sort of interpretative promenade throughout the thickness of the buildings and bring the park inside, especially in the winter. This was an interesting strategy for us because we could kind of claim the possibility of the public on this island, even as it was to be developed as a kind of private proposition. And so anything that is commercial or residential and private would be sandwiched between two layers of public, a public ground with a sense of kind of porosity on the ground between the kind of programs within the warehouses and the park, and then also the existence of this public promenade at the roof to really maintain the kind of access for these warehouses. So this is the kind of strategic insertion of this promenade at the roof of the warehouses, which kind of takes you through the experience of these walls and connects a series of larger gardens kind of that bring light to the depth of the buildings and create these connection to the outside and back to the city. So again, this kind of idea of perforating. This promenade doubled with the infrastructure for all of the warehouses, and so allowing us not to kind of carve the foundations of the buildings, which are quite fragile. So this is the kind of sort of promenade taking you through the various experiences and new kind of cultural programs, and then landing at the ground of building 17. And so one of the requirements that the city had in terms of kind of bringing the island in a way to one of its historical moments was this sense that it needed to be completed as an ensemble. There was always this building here which had never been built, and so the kind of island remained open when it was meant to be closed. And so for us, that closure, kind of bringing architecture, landscape, and infrastructure together for the kind of main museum, that closure became an opportunity to really kind of bring the kind of city edge on the outside and the park on the inside together to form a building that was partly landscape, partly built, and partly infrastructure in terms of holding all of the main units of the island. So on the city side, it really completes the ensemble and registers the kind of building around, and on the park side becomes this kind of extensions of the park with a balloon platform to experience the island from a kind of higher point and to experience the city without, again, having to build a kind of tall structure. So in the winter, the park sort of moves inside, and in the summer, the kind of park-like building becomes a kind of auditorium to kind of view the island. So the next project takes kind of the notion of green in a different direction, and this is the kind of architecture as not only intersecting with systems, but also looking at the possibility of the urban and the rural and the natural kind of coming together. And this is a direct a result of the Public Farm 1 competition, where we were invited by the activist and chef Alice Waters to design the first edible schoolyard in New York. And the site is Brooklyn in Gravesend. And we were able to kind of take everything that we had learned from PS1 and kind of apply it to a kind of real situation. So taking half an acre of parking lot and turning it into an organic sort of edible garden, organic garden for kids K through 5, K through I think it's K through 9, to grow food, learn how to cook it, eat it, compost it, and integrate that within the curriculum, whether science or kind of art, etc. And so the idea for beyond the garden, the idea for the building was to, one, create a kind of playful structure and a sort of pedagogical structure where each part of the building was really kind of making a statement in terms of how it both interacted with the garden but also with the other parts. So the greenhouse, the kitchen classrooms, and then what we call the systems wall, where all of the kind of infrastructure, so composting, water collecting, chicken coop, tool storage, all of the stuff that makes the building work, and the garden are kind of very expressed formally to kind of communicate sort of playfully what they do. So this is the winter. So even in the winter, the structure looks happy, and but also has a kind of sense of excess and playfulness. And here you see the kind of systems walls with the water cistern, the kind of air entrance tower, and the tool and chicken coop shed in the back, the kitchen classroom, and then the greenhouse with this kind of very clear sandwich. We were, again, taking this notion of archive. We are very interested in the work of sight, in the way that they played with green as a material and kind of sandwiched things together in kind of very obvious ways. And that was kind of one inspiration. And then the second, looking at ways to integrate the building with the garden, not just through the kind of water system, let's say, or composting system, all these invisible systems, but also looking at the facade as a surface that could communicate that integration. So taking our favorite flower pattern, the Venturi Scott Brown pattern on one of the best stores, and sort of using the kind of residential scale of these shingles in a slightly different way to kind of reinterpret that pattern in a sort of more awkward way, let's say. So these are the flowers, and the outside becomes inside at the greenhouse level. So here the kids during the winter really use the greenhouse. It's really exciting in terms of what happens here in terms of the curriculum and how that is fully integrated within the kind of their learning experience. The kitchen classroom inside with the kind of gradient of color to organize the kitchen, and here you see at night, and then the greenhouse. And we're doing now the second one in Harlem, where we're exploring planters and a roof garden, and it's currently the planters are there and the roof garden is in process. So taking many of those ideas, but at a completely different scale and in a way, in a different context. This is a conference center we won the competition for in Gabon, in Libreville, which is here. It's sort of West Africa, but it's actually considered to be Central of Africa. Gabon is a very interesting country for its incredible landscapes and ecosystems. It's very well preserved, and the kind of competition question was, how do you sort of quote unquote represent an emerging economy that is moving really from an oil economy to a sort of green service economy, looking at questions of ecotourism and also diplomacy as a form of economy generator. So the conference is really meant to host diplomatic meetings, and in particular African Union meetings. What's interesting about the country as well is that the capital, Libreville, is really on the edge, incredibly dense, and that density is what is allowing the kind of rest of the country to be quite preserved, and the president is working on further preserving that landscape. There is as with many countries in Africa, an incredible richness in kind of tropical modernism and beautiful structures. And what was inspiring, so that kind of history was very interesting to us. And we discovered this architect, Diolivo, who had worked with Solari for many years and was one of these Italian architects. There's a lot of Italian architects that worked in Africa, had worked also in Baghdad, and so kind of global practice of his time. And he was very interested in ecology and urbanism. And so that was his, and wrote a book on that, and that was his kind of master plan for Libreville, so kind of organicist integration of urbanism and kind of quote-unquote nature. But so this was also the kind of history we were interested in, the kind of tropical modernism and also this sort of integration between built and green. The site for the project is this park, which is slightly elevated relative to Libreville, the city below, and is a diplomatic park for UN buildings, diplomatic villas, etc. And so what was important for us was that as soon as you kind of came up from the city, you could really see the building, and the roof becomes the main facade, in fact, where the kind of architecture is perforated by these kind of voids, these courtyards, and each courtyard represents one of the kind of ecosystems of the country, and the roof is sloped to collect the water, and kind of that becomes the way of kind of celebrating this sort of emergence. And the kind of integration between architecture and landscape, like the edible schoolyard, is really done through the kind of systems of water. So the water collected gets cleaned throughout the landscape and then gets reused inside the building, as well as through a sort of transparency and the layering and the thickening of the facade, where there's a kind of, there are louvers on the exterior made out of local limestone, which kind of have a gradient to negotiate both views and light, and in between, and the kind of facade is really two layers, and to create this kind of sense of depth, and these kind of perforations happen also at the facade, where these courtyards are also kind of made visible and kind of very strong moments in the facade. And in between the two sandwiches is this kind of exterior loop that connects all of the main courtyards. And so as we kind of thought about it as a place of informal meeting. As you know, in conferences, maybe such as these, the most important conversations actually happen in between the moments where you meet. And so we wanted to kind of really kind of engage with that. So you can either look out onto the landscape or then look inside towards the courtyard. This is the kind of perforated inner skin that allows you to access also the kind of programs on the inside. And so here you see the kind of large-scale model with the water collection at the top, and then the kind of perforations all around, the double skin, both at the roof and on the sides, and then the courtyards, with one of the main courtyard being where, kind of building on what we had done for Nature City, there is a sort of a waterfall that recycles the water, but that moment in the pipes, in fact, is kind of scaled up to celebrate that. This is a mock-up that we did in Vermont. It's half scale. One of the other courtyards is a kind of very dry stone courtyard, and then there's this sort of food growing agricultural courtyard. There was a big sort of coffee culture, and so kind of bringing that back into the building. And so here you see the plan where the kind of inner auditorium is kind of at the main one is at the heart of the plan. There's a kind of thickness of core programs which are shaped in this kind of hexagon shape as a kind of record of the conference center that was there before, and then the kind of perimeter which is eroded by these courtyard and this kind of white space in between for the lobby. So you really have the sense of these volume kind of carving the building on kind of all sides, and in between is this kind of white field which kind of was inspired by this kind of modernist, tropical modernist transition. So a real kind of sense of tension between the two. And wherever we could, especially with the main venues, we registered what was happening in terms of that integration. So for example, in the main auditorium, the water collection is registered through the kind of topography of the roof. Each smaller venue is connected to one of the courtyards, both literally and physically through windows or access, or also through a kind of material sensibility. So for the Orchard Auditorium, we have this kind of sense of the weight of the earth at the ceiling above. The kind of Rainforest Auditorium is, echoes this kind of sense of clearing in terms of the materiality of the kind of perimeter wall. And then the most kind of technologically advanced auditorium has a kind of large window onto the stone drier courtyard. And for the only kind of venue, smaller venue, this is the press room that doesn't have this kind of connection to one of the kind of open voids. It was an interesting moment where the geometry of the facade and the geometry of the room allowed us to create this this kind of fake, let's say, void that is this kind of also moment of otherness there. This is the restaurant at the top, and a view onto the kind of landscape from the bar. And so this is my favorite drawing for the project, which is this kind of inner life of the systems that kind of sometimes get revealed, especially at the kind of outdoor courtyard moment. It's under construction, it's going very slowly, but hopefully it will happen. So this next project is a project we did for Wieden+Kennedy, an ad agency in New York. And even, as you know, New York architects do a lot of interiors. The city is already quite built. And nevertheless, for us, it's very important that many of these kind of urban concerns about density and a kind of integration of inside and out happen even at the kind of smaller scales, let's say, of interiors. And so the site is in downtown Manhattan on the 6th, 7th, and 8th floor of this building. And what was interesting for us was the possibility of rethinking work and kind of creative spaces, and how that's has changed quite a bit in the last 5-10 years, and it was an opportunity for us to kind of enter into that world. Again, taking a sort of urbanist thinker approach, we wanted to set the project in contrast to, let's say, a Google model, which for us is very much a kind of, we associate Google with a much more sprawling, LA-style kind of, well, not LA, but let's say suburban style of kind of pods distributed horizontally, and instead wanted to kind of, again, emphasize this question of density. So contrasting, let's say, the density of a Google to what we wanted to achieve at Wyden. And by doing that, negotiating the relationship between the individual and the collective, where by simply looking at, let's say, dimensions between tables and columns, we actually were able to move from 6% shared collective space for meetings and kind of creative thinking, etc., to 25%, so much more kind of shared moments of collaborative moments, which are becoming which have become increasingly sort of important in creative environments. And so the second aspect was kind of scale, not only in terms of size, but in terms of time. The focus became on these meeting rooms and a kind of gradient of meeting rooms where you could decide the kind of what does a 10-minute meeting look like, what does half an hour look like, what does 1 hour, etc. Because these needs really, you don't always need a very large scale rooms. You can just have a kind of phone booth or a kind of counter surface. So this is the interior. This is the over-the-counter meeting. You can spread for 5 minutes your kind of presentation, and it's very fast and efficient and open. This is the kind of semi-private meetings. These lounges exist at different levels in the space. So kind of private, but not quite. Different scaled, more private meetings, phone booth scale, normal, quote-unquote, normal scale. This is a homage to Whitney conference room. This is one of the two main ones. The ability to work everywhere. And then the insertion of these much larger collective moments, which become quite architectural inside the three space. The question for us was, how do we connect these three spaces, these three floors, without creating a very large scale, let's say, atrium or something that was too obvious and too immediate. And so looking at this question of subtraction and perforation, which we were really interested in New Holland Island, we cut these very large Mata-Clark-like holes in the space, and that became a way to connect the various floors. So when you walk in, there's this kind of very large, overscaled object, which is the stair, and as you sort of move around the stair, you discover the kind of second hole that takes you to the kind of uppermost floor. So the sense of connection is something that you kind of discover rather than understand immediately. Obviously, all these big kind of larger moments are very flexible in terms of their use. So all large-scale meetings happen on the stair. And this is the only moment we had to remove a column, so the structure became incredibly expressive, because the whole building is designed for a kind of load of, an extreme load for the time that it was used for manufacturing. And so the code sort of forced this kind of very interesting, expressive structure. The bar, it is an ad agency. They use the bar a lot. And then as you go up the second stair with views down, is the kind of reading room at the top for, again, a different kind of meeting and collaboration. The other important element of ad agencies is the gym, which we use as a kind of black box theater. And finally, at the perimeter, always looking at this kind of thickness of the perimeter envelope and trying to either create it or find it, we moved the outer perimeter of the facade one bay in to create this kind of double height courtyard right on the edge, which they can use also for working or for yoga. And what was interesting about that is that it kind of communicates their presence on the street, which was kind of quite important for them. So that finding ways to occupy that perimeter is something that has been kind of recurrent in Gabon. It's very important, and it really became the main kind of project for this Miami Collage Garage. So this is, as we were invited to be, one of many architects to design the storefront of this parking in the design district in Miami. And so it's not enough that we don't get to design the parking, we only can design the storefront, and we have to share with other architects. But it was really fun, because it's really a kind of a fragment, if you want, of building, and how much can you do within this very small, thin fragment. So that challenge is very exciting for us, and we were given 4 feet of thinness that we sort of thought we should really think of as thickness, and find ways, again, within the thinness of the facade to create a kind of public experience for the city and for the kind of design district. And so the idea really became to explore that thickness and to create a kind of what became a sort of ant farm of vertical circulation where you can kind of read it on the facade, from the outside, from the kind of street side, and from the kind of parking side, you have this kind of series of experiences, from library to bookstore to kids kind of playground to water collection again, etc., in this kind of loop of systems and activities. And this is the corner, because we are at a corner, luckily, and we sort of are hugging Jürgen Meyer, who's next to us, and we kind of coordinated that kind of collaborative moment there. So here you see the model with the kind of art space in the middle, and this is the hugging moment. Very fun to work with Jürgen. And this is the kind of cadavre exquis of the project. And just again, so we have been exploring this for a number of projects, and for this one, it was a competition we got second place for, a storage for a museum in Harlem, and storage being completely opaque and kind of inaccessible and needing to be completely secure, and yet the desire for that particular museum to seem very open and transparent and accessible to the community. So how do we negotiate these two kind of opposing sort of desire, let's say. So here, again, became that kind of slightly different, but exploration of that thickness, where in fact all of the kind of core storage programs, etc., happen in a kind of gray zone, whereas the sort of facade becomes what is really accessible, literally accessible to the public and the kind of immediate neighborhood. So here, the kind of thickness of the facade becomes an opportunity for carving, where kind of pedestrians can go up this kind of art vertical gallery to this middle zone, where the museum is providing sort of meeting rooms, etc., for the community. And then at the top of the building are all the kind of offices, where the kind of shared meeting rooms, as in Wyden, are now pushed to the facade and kind of can become a way to access that middle outdoor zone here. So that's the kind of model. It was a kind of quick competition, but many of the ideas in kind of Miami become kind of explored at the scale of a building, and many of the working ideas of Wyden sort of are collapsed onto the facade. So here, as you go up the kind of from the ground to the kind of garden at the middle that is kind of dividing the building in two, with the meeting rooms, and then the offices at the top, with the kind of collective thickness of meeting rooms organized vertically on the facade, and sort of communicating between one level to the next. And so the last project is the one we did for the Chicago Biennale. It's a collaboration we did with the kind of practice ant farm. We've been in conversation with ant farm for a number of years. We've always been interested in their kind of uncompromising sort of engagement with the issues of their time, and the kind of space they existed within, between art and architecture, working on installations, a lot of politically manifest speculative projects, etc. And so for this project, we wanted to explore this question of archive, and very literally, Ant Farm's archive burnt, I remember the exact date, but 10 years after they were formed, the archive burnt, and very soon after the kind of practice disbanded. And in these 10 years, they were incredibly productive, but for us, it became interesting to think about kind of adding to that archive by redrawing some of their main projects in conversation with them. So what was missing was kind of redrawn or reinterpreted or misinterpreted, and that became the possibility for a project, a collaborative project. So we took 3 scales: the house, the building, and the city. We took the House of the Century and the Dolphin Embassy and the Convention City. They kind of, well, you must know Ant Farm, but kind of this pulpy, very figural sort of architecture, let's say, with much more thick, formless interiors, but they were always interested in this kind of notion of communication, etc. So anyway, so these are the drawings of the house that exist. The house is actually the one that's the most documented, but nevertheless, we presented these 2 drawings, which are just scans of their original that are at MoMA, and then we drew the plan and the section and kind of reinterpreted some of the inner life. We took the Dolphin Embassy. That project was so incredibly interesting in terms of, again, staging this possibility of a relationship between humans and dolphins, and the actual seriousness within which that conversation was kind of articulated through the architecture is very interesting to us. But the Dolphin Embassy never had any plans or sections, so we drew the plan. working with Curtis and Chip, and the section, both sections in both directions, and then looking at the scale of the city. This is Convention City, which never had a plan, but did have a section. We kind of redo the section and the plan. And it's very interesting, as we were redrawing the plan, it was very interesting for us to re-understand the practice as actually one that was also kind of looking at these questions of interior landscapes in a way. And looking at context, the context of two practices and how, while some of the issues kind of resonate, environmental concerns, etc., the world has changed. It's a kind of it was such a America moment for them, where the territory was the American territory, this kind of sense of endlessness, and now the endlessness it's not something that we experience anymore, and it's very much a kind of post-America sort of world. So that tension was very interesting. So the project became 3C: city, cruise, climate, convention, and kind of borrowing or reinterpreting the possibility of debate, discussion, exchange with other species, dolphins in particular, and at the scale of a cruise, which are today really scaled almost to cities. This is shot, but that's the plan. And here there were a lot of notions of the kind of living in the thickness really happens is only organized through these kinds of thickened wall of infrastructure for all the wet services, and everything else remains completely fluid. So the wiggles that you read is this kind of thickened soft wall of infrastructure that organizes everything else. And then the landscape underneath. That's it. Thank you.
Amal will take questions if there are any. I suspect there. I hope there are. Yes. Can you pass this?
Hi. So thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. I just have one question. So I noticed that in most of your projects, even though they are of different programs and in different contexts, you have involved the elements of green space, ecosystem, and the landscape. So I'm wondering how you see these elements. Do you see them as a material, or as a program, or as a tool that kind of like a master key that blur outdoor and indoors in different contexts? Thank you.
I think we see them as all these things. I think that they are often a way for us to be contextual without being contextual, and we're interested in literally eroding architecture's boundary, and this kind of multiplicity of material and systems, kind of integration towards finding new kind of architectural opportunities, but also programmatic opportunities, etc. So it's kind of the ingredients we use, let's say.
Speaking of ingredients, It seems like in a lot of your I see a lot of your projects as kind of a tasting menu. You have like lots of little, both programmatic and formal tastes of stuff. And sometimes there's an overriding framework and sometimes there isn't. But it seems like the tasting aspect allows you to have like really different formal ideas and that are often symbolic next to each other at the same time. And so I'm wondering does the idea of the tasting menu help you be symbolic? Does it help you, is there something about the tasting menu approach that is inherently symbolic?
You want to define symbolic?
Symbolic as in being connected to communication and metaphor and representation.
Sorry, I have to unpack. You said that sometimes the forms are different, or the meanings are different, or?
No, I was just saying in some of the projects there's there's a framework that's overlaid onto the different tastes, and sometimes there isn't. So like in the Edible Schoolyard project, you have like 3 really different formal ideas that are each very symbolic of something right next to each other. Other projects like Nature City, you have lots of different formal ideas. They're all symbolic, but there's the overlay of the I don't know that that's important. I'm just wondering if you think there's a connection between the idea of this ad hoc tasting menu and communicating.
Okay. So I don't feel like we do a tasting menu. I do feel we are interested in communication. I don't think that we use different forms. I mean, I think the language is pretty consistent in terms of the figures and the shapes, and there's a kind of simplicity that, so I think there's a consistency actually in the formal elements that we use that are combined in different ways, or layered. There's a kind of layering, and sometimes the layering can be more complex than others.
Yes, you should just ask the question.
You differentiated your plan and your project for the office against the optic results or against the spaces in the talk, I think the portrayal of the spaces in contrast to kind of moving space for the optic individual. But you mentioned that everywhere is a place of work. So I think this is the same idea behind the Google place, even the place of play, which is integrated to the place of work. But how do you explain the differentiation between your work and the work of the Google?
I think I was trying to make 2 points in terms of that project. Well, one, that are concerns, whether they are concerns that we have in a project such as Nature City, that are kind of concerns about density and urbanity, in fact, make it, and a sort of compression, let's say, make it even into our interior projects, that these kinds of urban, let's say, thinking make it even to the interior. And I do think that when you look at that particular project of Google and many of the office parks, let's say, it's a kind of suburban typology. And so we were very conscious of Wieden-Kennedy wanting to be a kind of urban typology of work. That was one sort of important position for us. And then the second, I think that with Google, there was this kind of work as play, or play as work, the kind of that you need swings or slides to be creative. And I think with Wyden, what was interesting was that work is play, actually, so all of the spaces are about work, that there wasn't this feeling like we needed to have, this kind of having to become a playground for it to be creative and an interesting place of collaboration.
You mentioned climate. Architects, how those issues permeate not just research, but the work on the and how much you as the designer help move the concept that how is that shifting working and how much pressure to encourage as a broader idea and interest in
So several things. So for us, and I think for most architects today, I mean, climate change is this. It's like war, it's this. This is where we are. So it's a discourse, it's a reality, and I think that, again, that we see that as necessarily a kind of conversation changer, but it's not evident that at the scale of architecture, the answer is just technological. The Gabon project is a LEED Gold project, but it's not for us the most important thing. The most important thing is actually maybe this sense of, throughout the project, there is a kind of desire to recast the relationship between the built and the unbuilt, between the animal and the human, between and in playful ways. But that space of invention, in terms of recasting these relationships through architecture, is where I think we've enjoyed working. And we've also enjoyed we always think of Loos and you had to be a plumber as an architect. So but plumbing is invisible, but you could scale it up and make it something architectural. And so it's using this notion of scale, which is disciplinary, but kind of in completely different ways. So a lot of these waterfalls recycle water, but they're also a kind of scaling up of an invisible. And so I think you mentioned clients. It's not very easy. And so sometimes there's an intersection and sometimes there's not. I think that we try. It's not evident, but that's why I think the practice holds on to projects such as the one we just did with Ant Farm, and that are completely speculative, and how we move the dial somehow. So.
On your work with
Expand on that?
Yeah.
Beyond what I've shown?
No, just your
How we worked with Eric, maybe? Okay.
I think you just have to write your own question.
But I want to know what. No, I'm very. Eric is. We had a long. This was an opportunity to work with him because we were in conversation for a long time. I think what was interesting for us in that discussion was you know this, and this goes back to even your between, which you have in this conference, which I think the between is more interesting than the two poles. With Eric, the question was always, do you integrate everything seamlessly and you just pretend this is the kind of landscape urbanism strategy? You just negate the object and it's all a field, or do you do the kind of MVRDV? You know the kind of walled. Well, not just MVRDV, but the walled dense city that liberates everything else, right? So, I mean, these are two very different approaches. One is a kind of field, seamless integration, and the other is if you kind of, and that was the conversation with Eric, this kind of in between the two, and this is where the diagram of the kind of bands came in. It was literally like, let's say we don't want to choose. Let's say we want both, and we want both the intensity of the urbanity, but also the intensity of the quote-unquote green. And we were really arguing about how wide do you need, the green to be to allow for, very specifically a variety of species, to allow for kind of, and then how wide do you need the kind of block to be. So that was the conversation with Eric. It was to try to find a sort of a proposition that was neither one nor the other. Does that help?
Yes.
He always asks a very good question.
Yeah, that's great.
I'll speak up.
That's great.
Right away in your presentation, you gave a lot of topic
That's a great question. I think there's a consciousness that the territory is not for us a cultural specific, territory. I think that I get very anxious about speaking about communication or kind of the return of meaning. These kind of meanings architects are producing today about identity, cultural specificity, the local and the global, and these kind of constructed oppositions between tradition and modernity. And for us, is very problematic. But it's hard not to negotiate. And so for us, the context of unpacking environment and the relationship between the urban and the natural, and that's the kind of territory that we're operating in, even if the kind of cultural context is different.
Could I ask maybe just to follow up on the communication question, because maybe just to combine the first question with Laurie's in that one, you all have a very distinctive graphical means of presentation and a very distinctive language for the way you present, especially the ecological issues and sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, in a way, one imagines that those issues should be so ubiquitous that they're not even issues, but of course they are. I just wonder, I think the first question was a really excellent one, because it was a question about let's say green as program, green as communication, green as infrastructure, green as circulation, green. So, but you all seem to do that incredibly well. You kind of move around these various disciplinary territories with an end in mind. Maybe because, and I think it relates to Laurie's question about the client, because. You don't really have to convince the. I mean, I would say you're not only convincing the client with the visual means by which you present the work, but you're also helping educate and convince others in the world. So when we see your project, it's not just about convincing a client about whether or not they should make that a green project, but the extent to which that language speaks to a larger kind of world about those problems. So it's about communication and education in a larger sense.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and I think we have an ambition to talk the same language, even if we are in this context, or if we are in a kind of in a larger audience. That this notion that you speak the disciplinary lingo with your friends, and then when you meet clients, you tell them your building is a flying carpet because they're Islamic. No, but I'm serious.
Yeah.
That's a problem, right? It's a problem. You should not make flying carpets. You should not, And so I think that we have a responsibility because we are producing meanings, whether we like it. It's not possible for architecture not to represent. I don't believe it. And so if we have to represent, then I think we have to own that and make mistakes. And we always simplify, we always reduce. It is reductive. Architecture is reductive. And so how we reduce and what we reduce, and so this is the kind of popular aspect of the work, pop, like literally. And so I think that's a kind of moment of this question we are in actually right now, which is to just say you have one audience, and whether you're working with the city or whether you're doing the Chicago Biennale, you're going to present a cruise ship that does, that is about the dolphins, and then one day something will get built, but so.
Because because Alejandro Zaurpolo and Sylvia Lavin and a numbers had this kind of discussion over their issue at some point. Alejandro was arguing that there is a kind of a specialized language that you use to talk about the same project to the client, and then there's another one that you talk about with your friends and those who read the right magazines. But you're suggesting you do not take that approach.
No, I
yes,
think we
I'm assuming.
I think as a kind of ethical position of an architecture and an architect engaged in the world, I think we owe the respect, or we owe respect, I have a problem with that notion. I think you can explain to anyone, when we did the Venturi Scott Brown pattern on the facade, the client was like, why? You just, but I think it's gone to an extreme because of, I think because of the way we're practicing all over the world, I think we owe it to our audience to, be honest. As much as architects can be.
A fresh concept in architecture. Or, do you need this? No. I'd be happy to come back there. Sorry. No, okay.
It just struck me in spectacular work, and I was also wondering, in your own experiences, bringing those practices forward.
Yeah. See, this is for me a much more interesting conversation about genealogy than any other, because I do think that the kind of OMA way of working is a kind of for me, that's the more important, the kind of sense of the collaborative, the sense of creating a culture for the office, the sense of this, there's a kind of flatness where everybody has a voice, and it's a kind of ongoing critical moment. We're always in a crit and a conversation, and that the work gets moved moved this way. And that fluidity, I also think that fluidity, I'd like to claim that you could see a generation emerging that is operating much more in this kind of collaborative, and not just architecture. One thing that was really interesting for us with White and Kennedy, comparing two kind of creative practices, let's say. Advertisement has always been two. It's always the artistic director and the copywriter. I mean, it's a couple. It's always been a couple. And in architecture, we have, it's so hard to get to this moment where authorship is multiple, or a duo, or a conversation. And it's very flat. And but it doesn't mean that it's not very strongly directed. And so it's both authoritarian and democratic, but very collaborative. So.
More? Okay, they're hungry. Thank you, Amale.
Thank you. A little long, maybe.
That's great. Yeah, that's great.